perfect. My name is Rich Tortorelli. I'm the Oklahoma City University Assistant Athletic Director for Communications. And I have these esteemed gentlemen here to talk about OCU men's basketball. Here we are in the 100th year of OCU men's basketball. To my far right, we have Murray Evans, the former Oklahoman State College reporter. In the middle here, we have Tony Sellars, who worked in local media before becoming the OCU SID himself, Sports Information Director. And also we have John Martin, who is an OCU alum and spent a lot of time with the OCU program leading up to this. So just, friends, just tell me a little bit in general. We've talked about how playing for OCU meant you had a target on your back. Everybody wanted to beat OCU. Just talk a little bit about that.
Well, OCU was the #1 collegiate program in the state. I started following 50 years ago when my brother was a student here. They were the #1 program. Nobody talked about OU, OSU, or Tulsa in those days, and ORU was just a gleaming world's eye at that time. So OCU was it. They were the ones going to the NCAA tournament every year. They were the ones that were scoring record numbers of points. So everybody wanted to be an OCU chief, and everybody wanted to follow OCU. My brother went to school here. First game I saw in Frederickson, Eddie Jackson, Bud Coper. Like I said, those guys were rock stars to me, and it made an impression. And I followed them. I'd go back home, and in my backyard hoop at night, I'd have the radio on, and I'd listen to Weasel Ware and James Big Game Hunter and Jerry Lee Wells and Gary Gray and all those guys, and I'd go out and imitate them. Out in the backyard after listening to them run up, 80, 90, 100 points on somebody. So that's where I started, and it just evolved through the years. And I know I saw John play, when he was with OCU, and I had several phases. I covered them, both in the Abe Lemons, Ken Trickey, Lonnie Nichols era, Paul Hansen era. I knew all those guys. I played sports against him when I was in college. It amazed me that Paul Hansen was the basketball coach, but he was also the baseball coach. And I played baseball against Paul Hansen, and a lot of the guys on the baseball team were basketball players. And so I had that history, and then I wound up, as you mentioned, working here for 4 years with Wynn Case and Kenny Clark, and the women's program rose up at that time when it was winning national championships. And OCU was still, up to 20 years ago, well, that was the program to be, even regardless of what level, whether it's NCAA, NAI. There were hard years, in the transition. They made it, and I know it's amazing to a lot of people what OCU has accomplished on the national basis, going back to the beginning of basketball.
Talking about 11 NCAA tournament appearances, it's interesting, a comparison whenever the NCAA tournament comes along. How many programs that made the NCAA tournament, OCU has more wins than some of those programs. Yeah. And OCU made the top 100 AP, top 100 all-time list of men's basketball programs. So John, just talk a little bit about what it was like just playing for OCU and wearing that target on your back.
Well, as Tony said, if you're from Oklahoma City, one of the things you wanted to do was play basketball for OCU. I was lucky enough to move to Oklahoma in 1984 and grew up on Northwest 27th Street, which is the northern border of OCU. And just kind of moseying around campus, I ended up walking through Frederickson Fieldhouse when Abe Lemons was coaching, and I was hooked. I had been interested in baseball, some tennis. Once I saw Abe coach and saw the players, I was hooked. That's what I wanted to do. And then lucky enough to 10 years later be a member of the 1994 championship team. Saw a lot of great players, met a lot of great people, played for some great coaches. And then in 1996, we also won the championship. I was a grad assistant then. So from 84 to 96, I was just immersed in OCU basketball. And part of that was that 6-year period from 91 to 96 where OCU won 4 championships. Unprecedented, won more games than any other program in the nation at that time. But going back to when I was a kid walking through the field house, I didn't know who Abe Lemons was, but shortly thereafter I figured out everybody knows who Abe Lemons is at that time. And watching him relate to the players was something that I don't think many coaches even did back then. It was such more of a my way's the highway and that mantra, but he was so much more relatable to the players, even though he was 40, 50 years older than them. He was very much a player's coach, if that's a good term to use. But just unbelievable time for OCU athletics and basketball at that time.
Well, I think the easiest way to summarize it, he told me one time, he said, I didn't have any rules. He said, if I had rules, I'd have to enforce them, and I'd be suspending my best players a lot of the time. So that is why he was certainly a player's coach.
Yeah, I came along 85, 86, so right as OCU was making the transition from Division I into the NAI. And I was a student at Oklahoma Christian that was in the Student Athletic Conference with OCU. Instantly, it's a big rival, right? I mean, you're just across town from each other. The very first time they played, it was a 1-point game at the Eagles' Nest. OCU almost came back from a 10-point deficit in the last 65 seconds. Came over to Frederickson that year, went down to a 30-foot shot at the buzzer that an Oklahoma Christian guy made to win by 1. Rivalry's on. I mean, and from then on, I eventually graduated, became a reporter at the Oklahoman, and John's right, the target is everyone wanted to be OCU. OCU was the gold standard, whether it was under Abe or Darrell Johnson or Win Case. And yes, there was big rivalries with Southern Nazarene, Oklahoma Baptist, Oklahoma Christian, all the local schools. It was a big rivalry. Whenever they played at Frederickson, there'd be 2,500 people in there, it'd be 1,000 degrees, and it was great basketball. But everyone wanted to beat OCU. That was everyone's goal. And when Oral Roberts dropped down briefly, they wanted to beat, knew they had to beat OCU. And there's something to have that target on your back. It didn't matter who was coaching. I mean, they went through several generations of coaches, and some of the teams, some of the coaches back then, the other schools, like Bob Hoffman was at OBU, Dan Hayes at Oklahoma Christian, think of Weldon Drew at Langston, Ken Hayes at Northeastern, all these guys who had hundreds of wins, Division I experience, or both, and OCU just kind of kept rolling. There was that one year, I'm not sure it was 94 or 96, when you all played OBU in the national semifinals. And I remember I was covering the NAI women's tournament that year in Jackson, Tennessee. I remember sitting in my hotel room in Tennessee watching that game. It was on ESPN, and I had seen both those teams a dozen times that year. And it went down to the last shot.
Yeah, and that was actually the national championship. It was a semifinal game, but those were the two best teams.
Yeah,
OCU and OBU.
no doubt.
The winner of that game was going to take on Life University, and OCU. We managed to win that game, and we beat Life by 20-something. It was not even a game like the OBU one was. That was a great semifinal. Probably nothing better than that.
And in the middle of it, Oklahoma Christian had played OCU, I think, in the conference championship game that year, and had the misfortune of having to play Life. No one knew about Life back then. And Life went on, of course, to become a big-time NAI power themselves. And Life took apart Oklahoma Christian in the first round, and then to watch OCU just bulldoze that team, just like, whoa, that's...
I got a quick story about that. So I was a backup point guard on that 94 team. So I didn't have to play a lot because we had a really good point guard that kind of handled all the pressure. But Life had pressed the entire season, nonstop, 40 minutes a game. They were pressing, and we didn't really have in our arsenal a press break offense. However, we had a point guard that could dismantle any full court press. So I was, about the day before the game, we're doing a walkthrough, and I went up to Coach Case and Coach Clark, and I said, hey, in case I have to play in this game, do we have a press offense? And Coach Clark said, hey, John, we've got Ivan Patterson. Don't worry about a press offense. And I said, you sure? Because I was kind of a coach in training at the time, right? But he said, no, we got it covered. Don't worry. He said, if you have to play, we're going to be up by 20. So I did get in the game. We were up by 20, but Ivan handled the press, and we had other great players on that team too. But I was so concerned about it, and really there should be no concern.
Yeah. And Life, I'll always remember Life because they had the chiropractic table behind their bench, and the players would get chiropractic adjustments during the game because that was really, I think, the only degree they offered. They weren't really a university, and I don't even know if they exist anymore.
They still do.
I haven't heard, but they had a brief meteoric run in NAI basketball for several years.
Obviously, we're talking about a great program. but it takes great players to create a program like that. Talk a little bit about some of the you mentioned Mr. Jackson. Talk a little bit about some of the great performances that you guys saw from
Eric
guys.
Manuel. I mean, that was the first great player that I recall. There's Luther Burks and Tommy Bolton that first year, but Eric Manuel. Some of those games that Eric Manuel played Greg Sutton or Will Roberts, the game at Frederickson, Sutton scores 68 points, which I think is still the Oklahoma collegiate record. Manuel had a very quiet 40 points, and OCU won in overtime.
Yeah.
They played up again in Tulsa. Sutton didn't score 68, but he had a lot. Manuel had a lot. They played again in the district championship game. But Eric Manuel was, I mean, to me, was the first just like breakout. And of course, he had the backstory of being in Kentucky and all that.
Well, really before that, though, Kevin Franklin was a tremendous player. And you go before that, still in the NCAA days after Abe left, I saw Alan Level play in Frederickson for the first time, and I said, that guy can play in the NBA. And sure enough, he was a late round draft choice, and he had a healthy career. He was one of the best players. I mean, you just go on and on with guys. I mentioned a bunch of them earlier, but even guys before we even were around, the Hub Reeds and some of those guys that played in the NBA that we never got to see play. And that was what was great about being a part of the university. We brought a lot of those guys back, and they're still, had great stories about Abe and all the times. But you mentioned Luther Burks. He's another guy that made it in the professional ranks for a few years. David Simmons, the father of Ben Simmons, and the NBA wound up playing at OCU during the Lonnie Nichols days. They struggled in those last couple of years in the NCAA, but there were still quality guys and people whose names you knew around the state of Oklahoma.
They recruited well locally too. Ryan Adel, who I think was a teammate of yours.
Right.
He killed the Eagles, by the way.
Sean Alexander was another one.
Yeah.
So about from 90 to about 96, we had a member of the OCU basketball team on the first team All-American list. Now it's Eric Manuel, went to Kevin Franklin in 93 and 94, Brian Hopgood, Ryan DeBose in 95, 96, Sean Alexander, Reggie Garrett, transferred from Arkansas. So just tremendous players that if I'm the commissioner of the SAC right now, if those guys are playing for the SAC, they would more than likely be player of the year, each one of them, or first team. There's no doubt. Those guys are just fantastic.
I think you mentioned Rich Travis and there's Gary Gray. Both of those guys went for 50 points each.
Great guards, could shoot. I mean, there was no three-point line then, let's remember that. And those guys were regularly shooting 25, 27 footers. Rich Travis was part of that Kentucky pipeline, Weasel Ware, Big Game Hunter, a lot of those guys that came from there. Gary Gray was right here, another one of those guys from Rocky, Western Oklahoma with the Coper brothers and Gary Hill and all those great All-Americans. And Gary went on to be a successful businessman and still, has been around the program a lot in the past and made contributions. And he played in the NBA for a couple of years when Cincinnati still had a team with the Royals. So he was a draft pick up there. I just think about all those guys and all those memories in that little hot box at Frederickson Fieldhouse. That was just a pleasure to be. In the NCAA, I don't remember the crowds being that large, though, back in those days. The first time I came up here after I came to school in Oklahoma City, OCU actually played Oklahoma Christian in the 1970s. And we came over here to play. I don't know if it was counted as an exhibition or a real game, but sat behind the bench and ragged on Abe the whole time. And he finally got mad and turned around and said something to me. That was my first interaction with Abe Lemons about 50 years ago that I got to work with him later on. But it's just such a story. I hated to see the building go because it was just has so much history, so many stories. The summer leagues playing in there when it was 150 degrees. Everybody, guys from OU, OSU, all came in to play and scrimmage in the summer because they knew that was where the best basketball was being played in Oklahoma City.
So you mentioned Abe Lemons was coming to your office quite a bit in his later years.
Yeah, it's funny my trajectory with Abe. So he's from a Peatone, which is close to where I grew up in Granfield, 20, 30 miles. And they always say Walters, but he played at Piatone High School, which no longer exists. But, I mentioned the first interaction was me yelling at him as a student. And then I followed his career here. I actually covered his team, University of Texas. OU knocked them out of the NCAA tournament, and I covered that game. And then Abe came back in all his glory in the NAIA. And so many stories that I'd heard, and everybody has their Abe Lemon stories. But I was fortunate enough the last couple of years of his life after he retired, he would come down to Frederickson every day to my office down in the basement in the catacombs. And he was looking for something to do. He didn't know what to do. So he'd just sit down in my office and tell stories. I didn't say a word for an hour. I just let him talk. And he would tell me about road trips and locking guys out of their rooms and saying he didn't have a curfew. He said, I locked the room, made them be outside. He said, I don't want them in their rooms. I want them outside. And all kinds of great stories like that. And of course, we've all heard the stories about talking to the referees and saying, hey, can I get a technical for what I'm thinking? And the ref says no. And he goes, well, I think you suck.
And let's clear this up. I did a search and figured out they attributed that quote to Jim Valvano, but
it was Abe Lemons. No, Abe told me that story well. And I had the great fortune, and this was not associated with OCU, but Nike had a coaches clinic, and they did a roast for Abe. They came back. But before that, they had a coaches clinic in one of the hotels here locally, and I was covering it for a television show. So I got to sit in a room. I went down and interviewed Dick Vitale, and I got to sit in a room with Abe, Dick Vitale, Jerry Tarkanian, Jim Valvano, Jim Boeheim, Gary Williams, all of these guys, and just listen to them. I was just a fly on the wall, sitting around in chairs like this, around the room, and them just doing the dozens on each other and telling stories on each other. It was just an incredible afternoon. And, there's a book a guy in Austin wrote about Abe, a guy named Robert Hurd. He's a story, but it's got all of the quotes, and you can find the original sources for all of those quotes from Abe Lemons on just about anything that you hear out there. One rebound more than a dead man. That was always my favorite one. Norm Russell, who's one of my favorite people, went on to be a judge out of Mountain View, Oklahoma. Abe recruited him. He was an anomaly, a 6'10" kid at a Class B school in Oklahoma, and he bypassed a lot of other big-time offers to come play for Abe at OCU, and he was kind of Abe's whipping boy for those 4 years because he knew Norm could take it. And that's where the quote he told Norm as he came out of a game one time, you got one more rebound than a dead man.
I loved him as a reporter. The fans want doctors bury their mistakes, others still on scholarship. I was fortunate enough as a young reporter, a beat reporter at the Oklahoman, to cover his final seasons. I remember him announcing his retirement in January, and we were doing the math. He had 590 wins. Was he going to get to 600? And it was a kind of an average OCU team that year, and they got just enough wins to qualify for the 5th seed for the District 9 tournament. Had to go to Oklahoma Christian. So he's up against another legendary coach in Dan Hayes. And when you know it, tie game, final seconds, Oklahoma Christian guard drives around Charles Weekly, goes up for a layup, and they call a foul on another OCU player. The OC kid said it was a clean block, and they should have got on the floor. But, of course, Abe was 4 seconds left, Oklahoma Christian free throw line, kid makes it, ball game. So down to the end, Abe was complaining about the officiating because he said, that foul wouldn't hurt a gnat. And so he was stuck at 599. And Dan Hayes, I guess the good quotes kind of bled to other coaches too. Dan Hayes said, at least I wasn't the Al Downing who served it up to him.
Yeah, I remembered that way.
But he was so much fun to cover as a young reporter. He was intimidating. If you were a young guy, here's this legendary coach. You know his history going back to the 50s. But he was very patient with this young reporter, and eventually he talked to him. You're going to get something useful that you can put in the paper that's going to get people's attention.
I was telling my favorite story earlier is back in the Midwestern City Conference game. The conference had a rule. OCU didn't get to play very many games in Frederickson at the conference because the conference had a rule you had to play in an arena that held at least, I think, 6,000 people or something. So they played some of the games at the fairgrounds, some of them at the Myriad. And so they happened to play a game at the Myriad in one of those years with Abe. And somebody, I don't know if they didn't pay the rent or what happened, they didn't turn the heat on. It's the middle of winter.
Which is the opposite of Frederickson.
Yeah, the opposite of Frederickson. So everybody's in this. It said, did they know there was a game tonight? The bathrooms were locked. Nobody could get in the bathrooms. So Abe, and this is Abe's sense of humor, but also making a point, right? He coaches the entire game wearing a trench coat on the sideline. Wore it, looked like Columbo on the sideline in this long trench coat, and he stood up and yelled at the refs. And people asked him, afterwards, he said, I was cold. There was no heat in this building. I guess somebody forgot to pay, the light bill or the electric bill or something. And he made his point, though, of what a ridiculous situation it was. But as you mentioned, as hard as he could be, all of his former players, would always come back to the 50s, would come back, and they loved to sit around Abe and talk to Abe. And if there was a guy in need, Abe would quietly do it, and Betty Jo, his wife, as well. They would take guys in and feed them and do different stuff like that. So that was people didn't get to see that compassionate side. He wanted that rough exterior out front, but that was to deflect, I think, a lot of the pressure or heat off his players and let him put that on himself.
Well, OCU has won 6 national titles, and that first national championship came in 1991. What did you guys remember about that team?
Oh man, that was an incredible team. That was in the midst of the 3-game winning streak, I think. I got to cover that team all the way through Kansas City. Funny story from that, I remember they're getting ready to play Central Arkansas in the national championship game, and Chris Weiss was the SID at the time here, and he had a young grad assistant, and I was riding with him to the arena. And Chris was just on pins and needles, man. And if you know, Chris was a high-strung guy.
Yeah, still is.
He still is. Heart of gold. He's high-strung. And so I walked go to this hotel room. It had to be the night that Bo Jackson was cut by the Royals because he had a hip injury. And I'm a big Royals fan. So we're in Kansas City, and we're in this hotel room. Chris is just going out of his mind with stress about, how in the world we're going to win this game. I'm freaking out because Bo Jackson was... And this poor OCU graduates, like, look at these 2 adult men, like, what, huh? OCU won comfortably. But that was a great team. Mark Chambers and Eric Manuel and Jeff. They just rolled.
Tony Terrell.
They just rolled people. And Daryl Johnson did a great job of just building. He really kind of built that team all in 1 year. And
and then the next year, then added some more pieces, continued that winning streak.
Went undefeated.
Went undefeated, Smokey McCovery, that group, and then even some of the players that were there before that '91 team that were still a part of the winning tradition. You were talking about when Abe would come down and just visit with you for hours on end. You would also visit, next door to your office was Coach Kenny Clark's office, and Abe would go in there and spend 15, 20 minutes to 2 hours at a time. I remember one time we were getting ready for practice, and I was a grad assistant, so I always was down that area too. And we're walking on the floor to practice, and Abe is still there, walks out there with us. And this is Kenny Clark, Win Case. I'm just a grad assistant, bright eye, trying to pick up on everything. And Abe walks out there and actually starts practice. He'd been retired. This is 96, so he retired in 90, right?
Yeah.
So, of course, Win Case and Kenny Clark were, let Abe do whatever he wants out there. That's a legend. So we got us in I believe it was a full court press offense. So we had the defense out there, and it was kind of going through some cuts and some movements, and everyone, no one knew what was going on, but we just went with it. And this is a legend out there doing some instruction. Now, was it what we had designed earlier? No, that didn't matter. It was Coach Lemons. He could do whatever he wanted.
Well, and I think people think about Billy Tubbs as being the guy that started the high-scoring run-and-gun ball, but Abe was really that when we talk about in the 60s with that, and people like Billy said, well, Abe doesn't coach. He just goes out and gets a bunch of guys, throws the ball out there, and then they do the rest. But as you saw today, Abe knew a lot of strategy.
He was a real
And
innovator.
He was a real innovator. He knew offense, but he knew defense. He thought of himself more as a defensive coach than really an offensive coach in terms of that. But he was had a good eye for talent. You mentioned not winning the 600th game for him. The other thing that I hate is one of those first NAI teams he had 34-0 and didn't get to, and did not win the national championship.
There's a story behind that too, because the first year they were in the NAI, they ran up against Dennis Rodman in Southeastern, and the advanced story that my old boss Bob Coleman at the Oklahoma wrote, the lead was, what if we put all 5 guys on him? How do you stop Dennis Rodman, right? And ultimately did Southeastern won that game and went on to finish third. The next year though, OCU was undefeated. Somehow the NAI stuck them with a 9 a.m. tournament game. Anyone who's familiar with the NAI tournament back in the day, they play 8 games, start at 9 a.m. No one wants to be in the 9 a.m. game. Like, you can maybe tolerate the 10:45 game, but you don't want the 9 a.m. game. They put OCU against Georgetown, who back then, everyone now knows Georgetown's a big time NAI school. They weren't back then.
Georgetown College.
Kentucky.
College, yes, of Kentucky.
Kentucky.
And Georgetown knocked them off. But I remember being at Oklahoma Christian and seeing that result. I just kind of sit up straight like, OCU just hammered us twice this year. And who's Georgetown? And yeah, I mean, they were 34-1.
Was that Luther Berg's, Tommy Bolton, the Bell Wilson?
I believe that was I mean, and
they by far had the best. There was no
it wasn't
talent.
even
There wasn't
close.
even close to anybody else.
Playing 9 a.m. game is that.
I can't imagine.
why they
You're
were
not
the
used
top
to that.
seed, and they were the top seed.
Yeah.
Why? I mean, to this day, I mean, that's been almost 40 years ago. I don't know why the NAI did that.
They probably have not done anything like that since, for the number 1 seed probably has not been playing 9 a.m. game.
I sure hope not.
Yeah.
But otherwise, there'd be another national championship.
Well, guys, are there any other memories that have popped up as we've had this discussion?
You know, I was just thinking, and John, you spent a lot of time in Frederickson. We talked about how hot it was. What a great gym, and it's a unique gym, the first hyperbolic parabola in the United States. We had the running stream, I guess, that was underneath the building, and that was kind of led to its demise. But that caused them to have to put that floor, had some space underneath it. And you'll talk to any player from any school that has ever stepped foot on there, from high school to college, and they'll tell you that Frederickson was their favorite surface to play on because you could jump to the ceiling. And I was laughing. I played JV ball for Oklahoma Christian. We came over here to play OCU. And I dunked in warm-ups and almost had a heart attack. I'm like, wait a minute, I could grab the rim, but I just dunked the basketball. And that was the thing about Frederickson.
There were a lot of guys like you. I was
Yeah.
one of them. I could dunk like maybe once a month on a Sunday. And it was on the floor at Frederickson Fieldhouse. And people would say, the goals are low. The goals are not low. The floor was so springy. Everyone had the best vertical measurements on that floor. And the few dunks that some of us got were
Right
on
there
that,
at home.
on that floor. Yeah.
And you could play better. I used to come over here and play pickup ball with Clay Stolt. Had a really great student crew with guys like Dave Morris, who wanted to work at the Oklahoma, and Jason West, I think runs the Missouri High School Association Communications, Dave Wester. And I played pickup ball with them. And I play like an All-American over here. And folks, I am no athlete. I never claimed to be an athlete.
That's funny.
But that floor
It's a great one. It's a great shooting gym.
Yeah.
Well, you talk about that. This should have been a pickup game the night that I came over to play. OCU didn't have a JV team. So what they did, they had one player, Lonnie Robertson, a guy from Mill Creek that had averaged like 40 points at 35, 40 points a game in high school. So they needed some people to play a schedule around him so he could play some. So here's OCU's JV team. They brought out Eddie Jackson, Arnold Short, who was an All-American in the 50s, great tennis player, and I think there was one other guy, I don't know if it was one of the Copers, and that was the JV team, and they beat us like a drum. I mean, at 45, 50 years old, Arnold Short was still, draining one-hand jumpers, and Eddie Jackson was out there shooting threes and doing stuff. So OCU was always a little different. In their thinking and their style. And I think that was part of the charisma, too. You had an Abe Lemons, then Paul Hansen followed him, the total opposite in terms of personality. He was the yin to Abe's yang, and Paul was his assistant for a long time, and then he got the job, and it was so different. through that time. But OCU has always done some things a little against the grain or different from a lot of the schools around.
I remember the Arkansas Baptist B team. It was during, I think it was 91-92 season. I'm out here covering the game. They're playing Arkansas Baptist, who's a little school out somewhere in Arkansas. And OCU beats them like a drum, which we expected. Well, I go back to the Oklahoma office at the time and look at the AP wire, and there's a score that night between LSU and Arkansas Baptist. And I thought, so I called Clay the next morning. I'm like, there was a mistake on the AP wire. I mean, it's what we assumed. They said LSU played it. Turned out LSU had played Arkansas Baptist that night. And so had OCU.
Yeah, that's right.
And they had 2 or 3 teams. That
And
were
we didn't
traveling
know,
Yeah.
we assumed it was a B team here because OCU was NAI. We don't know if the players on that box score were the actual.
No, there wasn't a big. They just had a bunch because what they would do is get guarantees from schools like LSU to get a cash a check. They played in a tournament at Oklahoma Christian. I'll tell this Arkansas Baptist story, and they were scheduled to play. I think Southern Nazarene, and I was broadcasting the game. There's no team. Southern Nazarene's warming up before the game. It's like 15 minutes before game time. 5 minutes before the horn to start the game, Arkansas Baptist walks into the gym. The players are wearing trench coats. They take the trench coats off. They've got their uniforms on, walk out on the court. The game starts. That was kind of the way that.
But we had fun. We had to this day. There's the legend of the Arkansas Baptist
Oh,
B
yeah.
team.
Yeah.
And
Well, they're NAIA now. They're
Yeah.
back in NAIA, yeah, but they actually participate in our conference, in the Student Athletic Conference in football and wrestling. But just backtracking a little bit, when Tony was mentioning the generosity of Coach Lemons, we can't overlook that. There were so many things that he did for the players and for his staff, and even after he retired and then passed away, still there were the remnants of that throughout OCU with Bernie Dunathan and Virginia Scott
Yeah,
and
great
Bud
people.
Samant and all the people that Abe was around and influenced that made OCU a special place and unique, but
Yeah.
also very special
Well,
place.
and we didn't even, you mentioned, bring up Bud's name, all of the Native American players that played for OCU, and they were upset when the name was changed from Chiefs. I know that was I sat on the committee that had to make the decision and vote on what the new name was going to be. And still those players, a lot of them today will still say, I'm a Chief.
Yeah.
But you had Bud Samant, there were, I'm trying to think of all the other guys, but there were a number of great Native American players back in the late 50s, early 60s that Abe brought in. They weren't getting opportunities at other universities. That was another thing for him. He had black players. A lot of black players playing for him when other schools that OCU was playing did not. And Abe, and that was another one of his things. I don't care if they were green, blue, or orange. If they can play, I want them out there on the court. That was kind of the way that he approached it.
Well, gentlemen, it's 100 years of OCU men's basketball. It had to have been fun, and it sure lived up to the expectations. Any final thoughts?
Well, I just, I was a part of this building when it came, and it was great. The Abe Lemons Arena and the Freedy Center and everything like that. And it was needed. You have to move with the times, but it was still nice to be able to go over there to Frederickson, and we still played a game or two there. And I just wish to this day so many great memories that they would have been able to keep that building, but time marches on. And I hope that OCU can get back to those glory days, and we've got more stories to tell next time we come around.
Sounds good. We got Murray Evans, Tony Sellars, and John Martin. I'm Rich Tortorelli. Thanks for joining us.